I have a $1,400 phone and a $1,400 camera. Let's find out which one is better. Throughout this video, I'll be comparing each of these on a scale of 1 through 5 based on all of these categories here. First, let's take a look at the frame rate capabilities of each of these cameras. And for that, well, I decided to get a little creative. The iPhone clearly wins in this category because it's able to record at 720p up to 240 FPS and at 1080p up to 120 FPS, whereas the Sony can only record at 1080p up to 120 FPS. However, I do think the Sony has an edge in quality here. It's a little bit more smooth, whereas the iPhone I feel can get a little choppy and unnatural, and the Sony has a much bigger sensor so it can capture even more light, which is really important for slow motion. So I gave the Sony a 3 out of 5 compared to the iPhone getting a 4 out of 5. Just because the iPhone is able to capture slower footage. Another way cameras are able to slow down motion is through capturing burst photos. And I decided the best way to figure that out is with a race. So the first one to 100 photos wins. So the Sony barely had an edge by taking 11 pictures a second compared to the iPhone taking 10 pictures a second. Now, are either of these numbers crazy? I don't really think so. So because of that, I gave the Sony a 3.5 out of 5 and the iPhone a 3 out of 5. Each of these cameras uses their own methods for stabilization. The iPhone uses sensor shift stabilization and action mode, which is a new feature to come to these phones that uses software to enhance the smoothness even more. The A6600 also has sensor shift stabilization. I don't know why I can't say that, but the lens also has OSS. I decided to push the stabilization on these cameras to their limits. Now, let's go see which one performs better. The Sony really didn't do that well, and that's just because it didn't have software at its aid. Now, the iPhone, it did really well. It's so good that I would honestly think that was filmed on a gimbal. It's that crazy smooth. The iPhone easily wins a 5 out of 5 in this category, whereas the Sony, it only got a 3 out of 5. Sorry, Sony. The most obvious difference between these two devices is their appearance, where one is meant to be used day to day and be carried around in your pocket. The other is meant to be used in an amateur to pro environment. And after all, if you have a more pro looking setup, you can generally charge your clients more just because of the appearance of your gear. Let's gear up each of these and see what the differences are. The Sony on one hand looks pretty high end, and that it can put out some pretty high quality content. Whereas the iPhone, well, it's still an iPhone. I will admit, I didn't do the phone justice. I only put it on the gimbal. There are plenty of people out there that have rigged their phones out way more than I have. But in the end, it's still a phone. And if you show up on set like that, your client's probably just gonna laugh at you. So the Sony did pretty well here, and I give it a 4 out of 5, whereas the iPhone only got a 2 out of 5. I wanted to see the difference in the depth of field between these two cameras. One uses AI to blur out the background, whereas the other uses high quality lens elements. Does the iPhone blur out the background? Yes. And at times, it's even more blurred out than my camera. But when we start to inspect things and look a little closer, it starts to fall apart. There are countless artifacts coming from the iPhone that really just make this look fake. And on top of that, the depth of field is very harsh. It doesn't fall off naturally, compared to the Sony, which has a beautiful fall off to the background and the bokeh looks great. It just does a better job separating the subject from the background in a natural way. So I gave the Sony a 4, and the iPhone I only felt justified giving a 2.5 out of 5, just because it doesn't look natural. It's not something I could ever rely on in a professional environment. The more recent iPhones are actually able to record in ProRes, whereas the Sony can record in log. Which one's better and what are the differences? The iPhone's files are definitely able to be pushed more than the log footage from the Sony, and that's just because it's a raw format. However, getting these files onto my computer was easier said than done. I was having issues importing these files into Premiere, it just wasn't accepting them for some reason, and after multiple hours of research, I finally got it to work. Naturally, ProRes files are just much larger in size, and if you don't have a Mac, it's not going to be easy transferring them over. So compared to the S-Log footage on the Sony, there's a lot of drawbacks. Even if the footage off of the Sony is easier to manage and the files are not as big, I think the iPhone slightly wins in this category. That's why I gave it a 4 out of 5 compared to the Sony getting only a 3.5 out of 5. So for the results, the iPhone scored 20.5, whereas the Sony scored 21. So it's slightly won, but in my opinion, it's so close that it could go either way. It honestly depends on what you're trying to use this camera for. And at this point, smartphones are basically a camera with the ability to make calls and texts. It can still create high quality content, I just don't think it's at that professional level. And I honestly don't think it's ever gonna be there because a phone is made for you to carry around in your pocket and it's meant for the average consumer. It's not meant to be used on a movie set. So if you're just trying to make content that's high quality, but only for your personal use, go with the iPhone. But if you want to take things to the next level and perhaps you want to make this a profession and you want to make money with this, I don't think you should buy an iPhone for that. Let's face it, a camera is almost always going to be better. It has way more functions and customizability that lets you create the highest quality content possible. In the end, the biggest factor is the person creating the content. If you have the skills and the creativity, you can make a high quality piece of content on pretty much anything. So go out and get creative.